This information was taken from my virtual course called ecollar Beyond the Basics. If you are interested in studying with me and learning more about what ecollar training can do for your dog, please reach out. I'd be happy to chat with you. I think this is a really important topic. For one, it's so valuable if we understand when and why e-collars got their start. That's going to help us understand how far we've come. And we're going to take a look at how far the technology has advanced over the years. And then we're going to talk about how those changes in technology influence the training techniques. And most importantly, how this applies to the training you're doing with your dog today. Remote training collars actually got their start in the 1950s, and it was due primarily to two men. One of those men, Dale Lee, was an avid houndsman. He had a large kennel of dogs, and he was an avid hunter of mountain lions, which is why you see that picture in front of you. He teamed up with another gentleman named Frank Hoover, who was also a houndsman, but also a retired Army engineer, who specialized in radio technology. Dale wanted to find a way to be able to keep his dogs safer. You can imagine when you're hunting a mountain lion and the dog is a long way in front of you chasing prey, A, they can run off and go after something else and then you could lose your dog, or B, they could engage with the prey that they're chasing, which is going to be dangerous to the dog. So there needed to be a way to stop those things from happening. By teaming up with Frank, they came up with what was known as the first shock collar. And honestly, the name was pretty fitting at that time. It basically had one level, and that level was very strong, and it was stopping power to stop those dogs from engaging or chasing when they weren't supposed to be. Now, I think the thing that is so important to point out is the reason the shock collar came to be was it actually was a more safe way to stop the dog than what was being done prior to that. I wasn't there. This was before I was born, but I have heard a number of stories about how dogs were stopped before we had remote collars, and it wasn't pretty. Dogs were being physically harmed, whereas a remote collar can certainly be startling, and back then it was straight up a shock, but it could not physically harm the dog. It didn't take too long after the initial development in the 50s for remote collars, or actually we're going to have to call them shock collars at that time, to come to market. So if you look at that photograph in the lower right-hand corner, the Ability Trainer is one of the first pieces of equipment that came to market, and that was in the 60s. Again, it was one button because it was one level. And even in the photograph above that, you see a similar type of setup where it just has one button. So the stopping power, the reasoning for these tools was simply to stop the chase. They were crude. It was one level. It was significantly high. But we have to remember that that was an improvement from what was being done prior. When you consider things like birdshot, actually shooting the dog in order to stop them, and you compare the safety of one versus the other, or trip lines, I think we have to recognize that the development was because people honestly had the best interests of the dog. Yeah, it was crude. Yeah, it was one level. Yeah, it was really strong, but it was an improvement from what was happening before. And that's the thing we have to remember, because as the timeline comes from the 50s to the 60s on into the 70s and what we're going to talk about next, things continue to improve. So when you look at that picture to the left, that's an A180 gold tube from Tritronics, probably circa early 1980s. But what you notice is there's two buttons on it, and we're going to talk about that. There's a red button, which is the stopping button. There's a green button, which is tone. That tells us something about the techniques beginning to change. The change was those 5 color-coded plugs that you're seeing in the photograph on the right-hand side. Again, this is probably early 80s, but suddenly they were developing the ability to change the stimulation level. So those 5 plugs went into the 2 little holes at the top of the collar. 5 different levels. It gave us a bit more choice. If you think back to that photograph earlier where I showed you the green button on that Tritronics collar, that was tone. So now we had 5 levels to choose from, And we had a tone button so we could warn the dog before we actually pushed the stimulation button. Still, it's not great. It's 5 levels, but it's better than 1 level. Of course, the other shortcoming is you actually had to get a hold of the dog and take the collar off to change one of those plugs. If you take a look back in history, we all know that the 80s were a time of rapid expansion in the computer industry. And by the 90s, everybody was starting to have a computer. It was becoming incredibly commonplace. Well, that's when the big changes happened in the remote collar industry as well. The ability to change stimulation profile from the transmitter happened in the 90s because that was the advent of the microprocessor. Now technology exploded, and it was no different in our industry. That photo in the left-hand corner is just a variety of tools that were in my training bag, but they all share one thing in common. They share the fact that you can change stimulation levels at the transmitter. So we went from having 5 levels in the 80s to collars in the 90s that gave us dozens of levels, or for those collar companies that were developing rheostat technology, 100 or more levels. It was really a game changer in the 1990s. I really wish the manufacturers could have had a crystal ball to look into the future at that time. I think they could have put their heads together and said, you know what, we need to change the name of this thing. It is not a shock collar anymore. This is a tool with a great amount of finesse. It's a remote training collar. It's an electronic training collar. Or maybe they could have called it a magic wand for some people. I don't know. But it is not a shock collar anymore, and that has been the case since the 1990s. Sometimes old habits do die hard, and here we are. We're still, having this conversation about how we help people understand remote collar training and how we wrap our heads around the huge advancements and what actually has changed. So let's talk a little bit about adjustable stimulation and exactly how that changed the training protocols. First of all, having the ability to tailor the stimulation level to correspond with an individual dog's sensitivity, that was a game changer. I mean, think about that. If the only thing you could do was shock the dog to stop them, then you're going to use that technology very, very sparingly. But now, at the tip of your finger, you can tap the dog, you can reach out and basically have this extendable leash to communicate with the dog. Now you can suddenly, you can stop the dog, but you can work with the dog and guide them in a far different way. It's just, there really is no comparison between stopping power and being able to say, hey, we're going this way, hey, we're doing that. It was just absolutely a game changer, and everything started to shift. That is why, again, I think the name should have been shifted somehow. If we could have called this a guidance collar, because you can gain the dog's attention and then give them guidance or direction about what you want them to do. And this is where we developed the e-collar conditioning protocols that are in use today. And we use the collar to reinforce desirable behavior. Suddenly it was more about what to do rather than what to stop doing. And as I said, this is where the e-collar conditioning protocols began. What they were doing back then and what we're still doing to this day is we're conditioning behaviors so that we can interrupt the undesirable behavior. We didn't have to punish for doing the wrong thing anymore. So for instance, if a dog was running after, was going out, so we have one of these hunting dogs that is going out a long distance, and suddenly they get off course. Maybe they pop up a deer and they start to go after the deer. Rather than just trying to stop the dog with a strong shock, you could precondition the dog to understand when he heard the whistle and felt the stimulation that it meant to sit. So now you have a known behavior that you can ask the dog to perform. So you can stop the dog by having him sit rather than just basically dropping him or startling him. By having him sit, now you can get him to look at you and you can redirect him to guide him back to the line that he is supposed to be on. And that was really the significant change. Now we could teach the dog what to do. We could teach the dog using the e-collar to stop and sit. We could teach him to come toward us. and we could teach him to move away from us. Suddenly, we had the ability to guide and communicate with the dog at long distances exactly what direction we needed him to move. In the earlier part of the presentation, I was speaking about the houndsmen that were hunting their dogs at long distances on the mountain lions. It really is the retriever trainers that we owe a debt of gratitude to for developing the e-collar conditioning techniques that we're all essentially using today, myself included. Pretty much all of the work that we see at this point in time is based on that early work that was done in the 80s and has continued to develop as the technology developed. But we owe a debt of gratitude to people like Rex Carr, who is considered really the father of remote collar training. He was a retriever trainer. There are other names in the industry, Jim and Phyllis Dobbs, Alice Woodyard. These people were instrumental in refining techniques, and not only refining them, but they got out there and they were teaching seminars, they were writing books, early video on VHS. They took us down a path of teaching dogs in a way that was coherent, sequential, and fair to the dog. I asked a friend of mine, Pete Fisher, to share with me a few photographs to use for this presentation. These are some of his dogs. You can see the retrievers, you can see the pointers. But when you think about dogs working at tremendous distance, 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards, the ability to communicate and stop the dog so that he'll sit and look at you and then cast him a different direction away from you so that you can get him back on course, or stop him and bring him back to you, that finesse is all due to the retriever trainers. So when we look back in history, we need to remember a few of those names. And I think as someone who aspires to learn a great deal about training dogs, working with people that understand that this is a tool that gives us that off-leash finesse because we can use it to reinforce desirable behavior. That's something that's so important that we want to remember. We're using this collar as reinforcement for desirable behavior far, far, far more than we are using it for any kind of punishment. When we understand that and when we put in the time teaching the dog these core behaviors, you're going to find that there's very little need for punishment. It still pops up from time to time, but basically you can teach the dog at levels that are fair and adjusted to gain his attention versus that one level, that high stopping power. You can tune in your dog, and everything that we're doing nowadays is just so much different. So remember this picture in front of you when you're talking to people that maybe don't quite understand how a remote collar is used. It really is about reinforcement way, way more than it is about punishment. So let's think about this from the perspective of pet training. For our house dog, our family pet, our dog that we want to take camping and to the park and out to the beach swimming, how is it that we can reinforce behavior that we want rather than worry about stopping behavior that we don't want? So simple things. If we taught a really reliable sit, that gets rid of a lot of annoyances. It gets rid of jumping for sure. If you can ask your dog to sit and he knows how to do it well and you can reinforce it, then he's not going to jump when people come in your door or when people want to pet your dog. Of course, the same thing goes for teaching a super reliable recall, which I think is one of the most important things we can teach to our dog. But if you can teach your dog to come when called, he's not going to bolt out the front door. He's not going to chase the neighbor's cat. You can stop him from going after that bicycle that agitates him so much. It's just, you can take him to the beach, you can let him off leash, and if he wants to run off too far, you can call him back. It's about reinforcing that behavior of coming when called. The same thing goes for teaching a dog to lay down. if you teach him to lay down and you can reinforce it, if he's walking in front of you when you're trying to watch television, you can ask him to lay down. Suddenly you don't have to be frustrated with the dog. You just ask him to do a known behavior. And of course, heel is a behavior that stops pulling, and place, that behavior where we can put the dog on a spot and keep him there. That's pretty much a game changer for most of us, just to keep the dog out of mischief. So by teaching essentially 5 basic behaviors and being able to reinforce them with the e-collar, we could have a pet that is very, very manageable, that we could take just about anywhere and have reliable obedience. And there wouldn't be a lot left over that we would have to punish. So, in conclusion, with our little history lesson, understand that e-collars have been around for decades. The initial concept back in the 1950s was to stop the behavior of chasing. And yes, the technology was crude at that time. But as variable stimulation technology began to advance in the 80s and 90s, it allowed for much more sophisticated training applications to develop. Those are actually the training applications we're still enhancing to this day. The primary focus was shifted to reinforcing desirable behavior and teaching our dogs what to do. Those training techniques provide the dog a clear understanding of how to control their circumstances and gain a reward. That's still what we're doing to this day. It's been a long time that remote collars have been on the market. Let's shift people's thought process and help them understand. I hope this little history lesson helped you get a better grasp of it also.